Wrestling video games. There's been a whole lot of them ever since Nintendo published the first ever one for the Nintendo Entertainment System all the way back in 1986. The game was aptly named Pro Wrestling, which featured a small roster of fictional wrestlers, but it would be mostly known for being a giant internet meme. Licensed wrestling games then followed with WWF Micro League Wrestling, which was text only, but soon after followed with the release of WWF Wrestlemania in 1989 for the NES and its first ever arcade debut with WWF Superstars. These wrestling games were simple button mashers with limited options, but as technology progressed throughout the years, wrestling games became more complex, with developers concentrating on realism with smoother wrestling animations, emulating how we saw the product on television. Both WWE and WCW had dozens of games released on a multitude of platforms, but some never made it to light. So join us now as Wrestlelamia looks at 7 cancelled wrestling video games. Number 1. WCW Mayhem 2. If you were a PlayStation owner and a fan of World Championship Wrestling, chances are you were screwed when it came to wrestling video games. WCW vs. The World was an okay start to the PlayStation's lineup of debut wrestling games, but those who bought the game quickly found out there was an abundance of actual WCW wrestlers. The gameplay was also painfully slow at times. A proper WCW video game followed up on multiple platforms, but anybody who's played WCW Nitro knows it's an actual dumpster fire of a mess. Poor textures, inexplicable jumps in speed and terrible controls all made this game a pass for many wrestling fans. Meanwhile, on the Nintendo 64, fans would get WCW NWO World Tour and WCW NWO Revenge, which were pieces of art in front of this abomination, and the less said about WCW Thunder the better. However, WCW's license with THQ would eventually end and they would move on to Electronic Arts, where they would develop and publish WCW Mayhem. Mayhem managed to up the quality of the games tenfold. It still had a number of flaws, but it was polished enough, giving us a decent roster of wrestlers and realistic gameplay. Things could have been better though, and WCW Mayhem 2 was in production. It was rumoured to have been developed by the much-loved Japanese developers Akai, who were famous for making the N64 wrestling titles. According to Unseen64, WCW Mayhem 2, also known as WCW 2000, would have branching storylines, as well as boasting over 1,000 moves in the game. Hardcore matches similar to WCW Backstage Assault and other modes like First Blood were going to be introduced to the series. Screenshots even appeared in the May 2000 issue of PlayStation Magazine. The graphics looked incredible for the time as they boasted using real facial scanning and a higher polygonal count for each wrestler. The game would never see the light of day as it was cancelled on March 26, 2001 when WWE brought out WCW. Of course, WWE had no interest in the game. Not all was a waste however, as the engine was used for EA's Def Jam series of fighting games. Number 2. SmackDown vs. Raw Online. Developed by Vertigo Games, SmackDown vs. Raw Online would have been the first ever SmackDown vs. Raw game to be released on PC and would have followed after SmackDown vs. Raw 2011 for consoles. The game was targeted to a more casual audience of wrestling fans, including a free-to-play environment that would have included microtransactions and of course online play only. A trailer was released showing off John Cena and Randy Orton, which looked faithful to its most recent entry at the time. According to IGN.com, players would take their newly created WWE Superstar or existing WWE Superstar and improve their attributes through winning matches, collecting rewards, unlocking and purchasing items for their wrestler. It would also feature a number of matches including Exhibition, Tag Team, Royal Rumble and a Championship campaign. You'll even have the ability to spectate other players during matches. Sounds all well and good, but the game was going to be initially released in South Korea of all places, and then they would have followed with some releases in various other Asian countries only. The game however would be cancelled on 2nd February 2011 for unknown reasons. Number 3. WWF Backlash for the N64. WWF No Mercy for the Nintendo 64 is widely agreed as being one of the best wrestling games of all time, countlessly ending up on the podium of a number of best wrestling video game lists And we agree. Its combination of a decent-sized roster, a plethora of wrestling moves, many of which weren't even used in the WWE at the time, an online modding community, just gave us a reason to dust off our N64 controllers to play it. Naturally, with it being a success, a sequel was planned on the N64 titled WWF BACKLASH. This would have been released in 2001, which is quite late in the cycle of the N64, as the PlayStation 2 with its much more powerful system was already going to be out, with the third installment of SmackDown being planned for release later that year. That game would boast better graphics, more players in the ring, and an updated roster being developed by UNKOWN. Unfortunately, we've scoured many wrestling video game forums, and not much is known, other than the game being 30% completed, and most of the leaked gameplay seems to be fake. Number 4. WWE Brawl and WWE Titans Parts Unknown. WWE All-Stars was released in 2011 with mixed reviews. It was a wrestling video game that featured a different aesthetic to most wrestling games at the time. That being a game which featured bulky, oversized WWE legends and wrestlers on the main roster, and over-exaggerated wrestling moves. Well, this wasn't going to be the only game to feature them. THQ had planned on releasing 2 games, both WWE Titans Parts Unknown and WWE Brawl. WWE Titans was going to be a one-on-one fighting game, and was planned for release on both PlayStation and Xbox, but it was cancelled for unknown reasons. There were a number of concept drawings for the game, but no gameplay has surfaced. 2 years later, a game called WWE Brawl was also going to be released. It would be a sequel of sorts to All Stars, and would try to contend with the popular Super Smash Bros. Series on Nintendo consoles. Perhaps the WWE were a little too optimistic that this would be able to contend with one of the most popular fighting games of all time. But the game was to feature destructible environments, something Super Smash Bros. Didn't have. Senior artist of developers Blue Tongue Drew Morrow said, "It was all going to be fast, very destructive. Like all environments get completely smashed to pieces while you were playing the game." Taking some inspiration from WWF In Your House, released all the way back in 1996, Superstars would have stages based on their interesting gimmick. This could see a ghoulish cemetery setting taken from The Undertaker's character, or a C-Nation auto garage taken from Cena and his love of cars. It also included Mecha Vince. But despite footage of the game circulating around which shows it being in a near completed state, WWE pulled the plug on the game. Why? Well, according to WWE, there's no single explanation as to why WWE Brawl didn't reach the finish line. If one must, the reasons for its disappointing cancellation include bad timing, an unsteady global economy, and the sheer difficulty in producing a game of this magnitude. It's a shame the game wasn't released, as the gameplay looked fun and exciting with its destructible environments. Hopefully the WWE will revisit a similar game in the near future. Number 5. TNA Impact 2. Believe it or not, there was a time when TNA actually had some big stars in their company, and was big enough to enter the video game market by releasing their own licensed game. Developed by Midway Games, it featured some incredible graphics for the time, with high detailed textures for its wrestlers and motion captured wrestling moves. Whilst this was all good on paper, gameplay was limited, as due to the motion capture, moves were limited. Plus, many features were missing compared to its competitor. Oddly, the game featured no championship belts, and it suffered from limited options, repetitive gameplay, and inconsistent AI, which all led to the game receiving mixed reviews. TNA would announce a sequel, and it was given to South Peak Games, but a true sequel was never made. They would release TNA Cross the Line for the PSP and Nintendo DS, but this was just an updated version of the original game, adding several new wrestlers and removing those who weren't in the company anymore. Number 6. CHIKARA RUDO Resurrection. This game was first announced in April 2010 for multiple platforms including the PC, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Now, even though the game is licensed by CHIKARA, it's not actually a wrestling video game. Rather a 2.5D side-scrolling beat-em-up which utilizes wrestlers from the promotion and set in a futuristic cyber world. In a 2014 interview on website Press to Reset, the developer wanted to promote fast-paced combat that mixes the signature moves of CHIKARA's wrestlers with the action controls of a side-scrolling brawler video game. Beyond that, the team plans to reward different styles of gameplay while endeavouring to maintain a certain level of challenge for its players. The game was in development for 4 years until WCW Games had been given the rights to the game, and we say was because no progress seemed to be made on the game since its funding was deemed unsuccessful on Kickstarter. The project's funding goal was $50,000, but only managed to raise $18,765. However, it was said in an early interview that the team required a much larger goal of $350,000, which would have seemed impossible. CHIKARA seems to have moved on from the game and is currently working on CHIKARA, action arcade wrestling video game. A campaign to fund the game's production is on Indiegogo and seems to have met its target of £19,000. And number 7, WCW NWO Live. In 1998, THQ had 2 games in development, one being WCW NWO Revenge, which would be slated for the PlayStation, and the other would be WCW NWO Live for the Nintendo 64. However, somewhere during development, both titles were switched around, and instead, we got WCW NWO Revenge for the N64, and WCW NWO Live was going to be for the PlayStation. And get this, it was going to be made with the UNKOWN Retsuden engine, which was the same engine used in early WCW games. Magazine and internet articles were published showing Live being ready to be released in fall of possibly 1998. The game was unfortunately sat on as the WCW license was expiring with THQ. WCW then left THQ in favour of EA, where we got WCW MAYHEM, and THQ/UKOWN ended up with starting the SMACKDOWN series. Had the original plans of this game gone ahead, we might have had an entirely different history of wrestling video games. But there you have it guys, 7 wrestling games we never got to play. Are there any others that we didn't get to play? Let us know in the comments down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling content.